Good evening. No one would pretend that wealth is anywhere near evenly distributed across the globe, but if research published by Oxfam today is to be believed, the extent of the inequality is truly shocking. On the eve of this year's World Economic Forum, the charity says that by next year the world's richest 1% will share more wealth than the remaining 99% put together. Oxfam's figures claim that the wealthiest 1% of people currently have a 48% share of global wealth. But Oxfam claims they're continuing to increase their share of total global wealth and will own more than 50% by 2016. And it's not just that 48% of wealth owned by the 1% of people, an extra 46% is owned by the next wealthiest 9%. Looking at it another way, that means that 80% of the world's population owns just 5.5% of the planet's riches.
World leaders have done very, very little in the last 20 years to tackle inequality. In fact, they've done lots to increase inequality. They've done a lot to reduce tax rates on the richest people, the richest corporations. They've done a lot to privatise healthcare, education. They've done many, many things that we think increase inequality around the world. So we think world leaders could do a lot more to stop harming and start helping.
Well, I'm joined here in the Gherkin by Ben Southwood from the Adam Smith Institute, and hopefully later on by Faiza Shaheen, and she's Head of Inequality and Sustainable Development at Save the Children. Well, Ben, let me start with you while we try and get Faiza on the line. How reliable are these figures, in your opinion?
Well, the actual numbers are all completely legit. They're the same as the ones compiled by Credit Suisse, and they've compiled them completely correctly. The problem is that because they're net figures and they include debt, they have some very funny outcomes. So, for example, Michael Jackson, before he died, would have been considered one of the poorest people in the world, rather than a rich person as we might consider him. Similarly, people who've just finished their Ivy League degree in their first 10 years at Goldman Sachs as an investment banker, they'd be considered very poor people. Whereas some rural Indian farmers...
Because they've got big net debts.
They've got big net, they owe lots of money, whereas their assets, which are maybe their education or their skills, they're not counted as an asset, so it doesn't show their wealth. People like rural Indian farmers, for example, they might own $5 of capital, one tool they might own, and they might have a bit more capital than they have debt. But that would show them as being much richer than these investment bankers. Of the bottom 10%, 7.5% of that bottom 10%, according to Oxfam, come from the USA, and only just less than come from India. These figures are very strange. So there are alternatives we can. I would look at global Gini coefficients, which give a much more accurate reading of people's incomes in different countries. Those show that the inequality has been going down as we've seen the rise of the global middle class in India and China and even in Africa. And if you look at numbers on $2 a day, for example, that's dropped from something like 70% 30 years ago to 40%. Now, everything isn't perfect, but it seems like the world is developing, the poorest are getting better off, global inequality is falling.
Do you not feel, though, a teeny bit uncomfortable? I mean, particularly when, we're about to see at Davos this sort of annual get-together of global plutocrats and all the rest of it. I mean, it doesn't make for easy viewing, even if you're a supporter of markets and free trade and capitalism.
Well, I think lots of people have a problem with inequality, and that's fine. It's okay to have a problem with inequality. I don't think there's good evidence that inequality harms lots of measures. People think it subverts democracy. That might happen, but I don't think there's good evidence of that. Some people think it makes growth worse, but the main reason it makes growth worse is when you have inequality, you have to dampen it with taxes. Taxes make growth worse. So if the solution to inequality is taxes, then you're going to make growth worse, and growth is what lifts us all out of poverty. So I can see why people are upset by inequality. I don't share that myself. I worry about poverty and wealth of the badly off people. I don't worry about the difference between different groups.
Poverty in absolute terms. So what are your prescriptions then for reducing inequality?
Well, the problem is I'm not sure I think it's a good idea. Most of the solutions people offer, for example, wealth taxes or capital taxes, economists tend to believe these are the worst kind of taxes. They lead to reduced investment, and investment is what makes us richer in the long term by increasing our productivity. If I had to reduce inequality, I'd say we should tax the consumption of the wealthy. So I'd say, for example, you have to give your income and your saving, and you get taxed on the amount you don't save, because saving goes into investment, makes us all better off. But consumption, having big cars, private jets, that kind of stuff, it doesn't really hurt if we tax that. So if I had to reduce inequality, I'd tax consumption.
So you'd favour, for example, then higher rates of VAT on luxury goods, which I think is a UKIP policy, isn't it?
Yeah, perhaps that would be one way of achieving that. I prefer if it didn't look at what goods they consume, but just their total consumption. And then if you do £100,000 of consumption a year, say, or more than that, then you pay a slightly higher rate. This would be hard to do within the given tax system, but I think it's basically the only good tax policy we have for reducing inequality. The solutions that Oxfam offers, wealth and capital taxes, I mean, this is something where you find a rare consensus that economists think, no, you should tax consumption and income. You shouldn't tax wealth and capital.
And I guess, should we be surprised at this, given that, I mean, this rise in inequality is said by Oxfam to have increased since '09. I mean, one of the big things that's happened since '09 has been quantitative easing, which by definition pushes up asset prices, and therefore, if you've got them, you become wealthier.
Well, yeah, and that may well be true. I think that even if quantitative easing increased inequality, then the reason it probably did that is because it averted a depression. A depression, it's true, destroys loads of asset values, and that would make the rich much poorer than it would make the poor poorer. But that's not the kind of inequality reduction we'd like to see. We want to see inequality reductions where the rich get a bit richer and the poor get much richer. Yeah. And that's what we're seeing across the world, because the average person in the UK hasn't seen much income gain in the last 10 years. The average person in the UK is rich by global standards, but the average person in China has seen gigantic income gains. Average person in India, almost as big. Average person in Sub-Saharan Africa, similar gains in their income. Perhaps not as big as those two, but still substantial. So I would agree, QE perhaps did increase inequality. Some people think it did, and I respect those people. But even if it did, the alternative was a depression, and we don't want that. OK. Well, I think we can now join Fazia Shaheen from Save the Children. Hello, Fazia. Nice to see you there. Let me just ask you, charities like yours and Oxfam, aren't you all about helping the poor rather than bashing the rich?
We are very much about helping the poor, but poverty and inequality are, of course, two sides of the same coin. We see poverty now is mainly concentrated in middle-income countries, and that does raise the question of inequality and redistribution. And I just want to say that, actually, if you believe now that inequality isn't a problem, you're in the minority. The OECD, the IMF, Nobel Prize-winning academics all point into the very real economic and social costs of economic inequality. OK. What about, what will your prescriptions be then? I mean, we've heard from Ben here in the studio. He'd like to see luxury consumption increased, taxed more highly to reduce inequality. What would yours be? Well, the most obvious place to start, where we're already having a conversation globally, is on tax avoidance. It's about 100 billion roughly lost every year, and and the amount that's lost in tax avoidance to Africa is more than what they get in aid. So this is a serious problem, and there are loopholes. There's stuff that we can do about tax havens. We can do more about transparency, about reporting tax. So tax is a good place to start, but there are many other things that we can do, and doing something about asset inflation, like you say, is also something important.
OK, Fazia Shaheen from Save the Children, thanks for joining us. Glad we got you in the end. I'm Ben Southwood here in the studio from Adam Smith Institute. Thanks very much.